All right, everybody out there in YouTube land, welcome. It is I, Matt Yancic, the founder and head game master here at Manufactured Myth and Legerdemain. And once again, I'm coming at you with another episode of Role Player with 1,000 Faces. I want to say every week. That's what I thought I was going to say a year or so ago when I started this. I'd like to say every couple weeks. That's what I thought I could say now. But the truth is, on average, every couple weeks. If you look back over the past year, every couple weeks, I do bring you a new, interesting, and worthwhile creator to check out. And today I've got somebody pretty darn interesting, but before it wouldn't be a program, an episode of mine, unless I teased something coming up or said something else or drew you out just another minute or so for the algorithms. Before I get to our esteemed guest, I just wanted to let you know that we are out there on various different social platforms. We are on, if you'd like to check us out, we are on the Discord, we are on the Facebook, and we are on the Twitter, though how long we will remain on Twitter, it remains to be seen. And so what I thought I might do, and maybe in one of these episodes, I'm actually going to get out ahead of lettuce, and I'll be putting it out here to see how long Twitter stays up compared to, never mind, that's a joke that only 3 people out there get, and probably none of them in the demographic that are watching me. So at any rate, you can check us out on any of those social platforms. You can also check us out here on the channel. And for those of you, we've been getting like a nice little steady little growth of subscribers here on the channel. And to those of you that are new and just tuning in, thank you so much for doing that. We are small, but I'm okay with that. You know, like unlike those big channels with like 1 million subscribers, I can actually sit down and I can talk to you. I can say hello and all of that stuff. So please feel free to speak up in the chat or to send me emails or to send me hate mail. But make sure you subscribe. If you do send that hate, just subscribe and tell your friends to subscribe and to come together and hate me together. That's a wonderful thing. But at any rate, one last thing, because my mother is getting upset that I'm letting this sort of go on for so long. She likes it when I just get to the guests directly. In doing any of my interviews, I typically do a modest amount of research into the people that I have on the program. For those of you that are tuning in, you know who's on today. And so I was doing a little bit of research into the multiple iterations of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And I don't ordinarily do this, but I was so impressed by the service, I kind of wanted to say something, and the company has no idea that I'm doing this. But I had actually ordered a copy of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the enormous 3rd edition box. I am kind of like one of those guys that goes in there and I count the number of cards and tokens and all of that. I ordered it used online. And when it showed up, I opened it up and my spider sense, my hosting sense told me that there were some counters missing and there were cards that were missing. And it was not as described as they say. However, what I'd like to say is I immediately emailed the company that I ordered it from, and they were very, very nice. I've been ordering from them for years, and they sent me a replacement copy. I have 2 enormous boxes here. The replacement copy that they sent me was actually a mint in the box copy. I guess it's been sealed for many years. So I wanted to give a shout out to, they have no idea I'm doing this, and goodness knows I only have about 400 subscribers, so it's not like I'm doing them a huge amount of good. But if you're ever looking for some games to order used and you're looking for dependable service, I highly recommend that you talk to Noble Knight Games. Noble, N-O-B-L-E, Knight, K-N-I-G-H-T. They have an e-store on eBay. I want to say that they're in Michigan here in the United States. I may be wrong on that. I may have just blown the whole endorsement by appearing to be incompetent and unknowing of who's there. But at any rate, I highly recommend it. I appreciate what they did for me, especially because of tonight's guest. So without further ado, tonight I have with us cartographer extraordinaire. And if you've ever watched his live streams, within the first hour, you're going to be saying this guy is really good. In the second hour, you're like, man, this guy is good and he's a machine. In the third hour of his streams in which he details, you're going to be thinking, I have to go to the bathroom and this guy hasn't left once, but he's still going. In the fourth and fifth hours, you're going to be like developing some sort of infection or some sort of problem because you'll be sitting there waiting to go and he's still going strong like the Energizer Bunny of cartographers. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it is Andy Law. Andy Law, you're live now. Thank you so much for coming on the big program. How is it going over there? You're in Scotland, correct?
I am in Scotland, and we've had just a smattering of snow, which is super seasonal and wonderful and very exciting. And so far, we must be about 10 minutes into the stream, and so far, I do not require the toilet.
Oh, well, you know, this is a silly question, but I mean, for anybody that has ever watched your cartography streams, like it's stunning how you close one stream, I assume, if I can make like a little bit of a little double pun there, and to do another stream, you're sitting there for 5, 6, 7 hours sometimes. Was this always sort of part, were you like, okay, I'm going to sit down and the whole day I'm just going to, is that always part of the plan?
Well, it's more of a reflection of how I work when I'm doing maps. I tend to focus on something and then get lost in what I'm doing. And time just floats by, drifting, without me really being aware of it actually occurring. And then someone will say, hey, Andy, you should probably be stopping now. You haven't moved all day. And I'll be like, what pardon? It's only 2:30. It's 10 o'clock in the evening.
Right.
Good point, well made. But when it comes to a stream, part of prepping for a stream for me is always not really eating just beforehand or drinking just beforehand, because that's inevitably going to be an hour or half an hour in going, oh, I'm a bit uncomfortable. This was perhaps an ill-timed eatage before I started.
Yeah. The lack of biological breaks on your 7 to 8 hour streams is stunning and incredible. And I think if scientists could harness that, I mean, we could probably, I don't know, we could send people long distances, or we could get people like a way to sit on a international flight crossing the Atlantic or Pacific without having to get up and go to the bathroom. That would, maybe everybody just needs to be making maps.
It's fair to say the last time I went to Gen Con and I flew over, I did not go to their rather scrubby, tiny little toilet.
Right. Well, Andy, thank you. That was not the question that I'd thought I was going to be asking Andy, but like like most of my chats, I just like to go with the flow to make another reference. I swear that was no pun was intended. Andy, can you tell us a little bit about, it looks like, so I did a little bit of research on you and I looked at some blogs and I looked at some other places and I found out that, man, you've been doing role-playing games like forever. And you have a rather unique kind of start in the business. What originally got you so interested in role-playing in general?
Okay, so unlike many of my generation, it was my parents. For many of my generation, it was the local hobby store or their friend that happened to be into it at school. They had discovered the great new thing, often D&D, sometimes something else. But in my case, it was absolutely my parents. They had racks of science fiction and fantasy books that I dipped into all the time as a kid. And amongst those were a few role-playing gems. And I did my very first role-playing sessions with them back when I was about 8 years old. I remember my first session well. If you want to know about it, you can.
Sure, why not? Yeah, what happened?
It was a unique session. Well, being from the UK, we had a set of books called Fighting Fantasy, Choose Your Own Adventure books. And amongst the Fighting Fantasy books, among one of the earlier productions was a role-playing version of it, where you could all sit around the table and effectively play a Choose Your Own Adventure with a group. And much of what would become later on, my preferences for roleplay were established in my very first session, because my mum, who was an artist, looked through the Fighting Fantasy book. It was called Fighting Fantasy. I think it was by Mark Gascoigne, who was on one of our streams previously, because I stream, much like you, weekly with guests from across the industry, which is super fun. And Marco's book. Yeah, there's Inside the Rookery. Go do a web search.
Yeah,
for
yeah. I
Inside
was just
the
saying,
Rookery.
I've got links in the
Oh,
links in the description.
You're a
for sure.
You're brilliant. Thank you very much. So anyway, that aside, my mom read through that book and she went, "Hey, you know what? I really want to try and make these characters a little bit different." So she practiced some voices for them. And then she looked at the art and went, "I want to show this art, but I don't want to show them the book in case they should be sneaky and read any of the text that might be on the page." So she redrew it all so that she could present it herself. She did a map of the entire place, which wasn't in the book because she figured that that would be useful for her understanding it. So she did a quick map for herself. And when we sat down for our first section, which was my dad, who was playing, I still remember to this day, he was playing a warrior type who was extremely thick, who whenever a combat would arise would shout, "Zombie! Zombie! Rah, rah, rah! Rah, rah, rah!" Because his character's name was ZOM/BEE. And my grandmother, who happened to be in this particular session, and she was playing D'Artagnan because obviously that's what she knew as something that was swashbuckly and very adventurous. So she did a version of D'Artagnan. And I was playing a wizard, as I recall. I have very weak memories of what I was playing. My brother, who was only 4, bless his soul, was playing as well. And that idea of putting on voices, my dad trying out different character things and deciding that he wouldn't just be himself, he would be something else. The concept of my gran getting sucked in as well, and that becoming something that she remembered every single year that she came up to our house. That game that we played, that was different and quite unlike anything she'd ever played in her life. The idea of presenting art, the idea of making maps for it as well. And you could argue the idea of the GM being someone who wasn't just there to tell or perhaps present a story for the players to interact with, but to also be a repository of pictures and different accents and different ways of presenting a game world. That sat with me throughout all of my early teenage games and became, when I turned professional, very much a source for the type of experiences that I was looking to try and help others create at their own table. Whether that was presenting art or maps that they themselves could just pull out without having to reproduce it themselves at home, like my mum did, or I later did myself. Whether it was things like that or hints and tips for how to present characters in a different way, even if you weren't comfortable with doing accents. So you could add perhaps mannerisms or a tone shift. Just little side discussions to try and help promote good play at the table.
Let me ask this though, because as you're describing it, and so I was talking to Andy a little bit before the stream, and he's self-professed like wearer of many hats, and I think as we go through the interview, you're going to sort of discover that. What was it, if you know, what you described to me sounds a lot like either being like in the theater or being in film or television or directing. Was there something distinctly different about role-playing versus theatrical, like doing something in the theater, doing something as, you know, for television?
I'm tremendously shy, as you can probably tell.
I can tell you're very quiet and
yeah, exactly. But I am tremendously shy. I avoided theater whilst dived into role playing because the group was much smaller and I was with friends that you could be comfortable with, and we had all discussed beforehand that I was going to try out some silly accents to be an idiot, and everyone was cool with that because I was relatively loud for all of my shyness, so that was fine. And to jump back on your wearer of many hats, I think in many respects what would become my later career was grounded in my very first role-playing sessions, because your average GM is a wearer of many hats. I mean, how many of us have sat down and gone, well, I'm going to create myself a new world for my next game. I'm going to pull out a map and figure it out. You're a cartographer. First job. And often when you're a kid, you go, I'm going to try and do a picture of my NPCs. They often don't work. We're not all necessarily artists, but you give it a go. If you can't do it yourself, you might go online and go, okay, I've got a character who looks like Brad Pitt. Download that. I've got a character who looks like this person. Download that. Let's put a silly hat on it. Photoshop for the win. Suddenly I've got myself a lovely fantasy character. So you're already producing your own version of that game. You're not necessarily playing exactly the game in the book. You're developing that game into something new. So you're a developer, you're a producer, you're potentially an artist, you're a cartographer, and very quickly you turn into a writer as you start building your own world. You start figuring out what your own sessions might be like. And through that, it might be simple. It might be nothing more than it's a pub. It's called the Prancing. Oh no, can't call it pony.
That's right. Intellectual property rights.
Prancing bugbear, and it might not necessarily, particularly for your first set, be all that imaginative or clever. And often the best adventures that we create when we start off are based on another piece of media. Like, for example, we're in the festive area. I'm going to make a quick session that's basically Die Hard, but for D&D. Or Die Hard, but for RuneQuest. And you'd mix it all up again, and you change the characters, and then suddenly you're telling quite a different story. And then as you consider where it's set and the new rules that you employ, which might be magic, or which might be some new form of technology, suddenly that twists the entire scenario in a new direction, and it's no longer just a pale reflection of the media that you're drawing from. It suddenly becomes something new and exciting that your players will take probably in a completely different direction to what you expect. So you become a writer all of a sudden, or an adapter if you prefer, as you make your own adapted scripts. And all GMs who have been doing it for any length of time sort of become wearers of many hats. And as I moved into the professional side of it, I didn't really stop that part. I didn't focus in one area, although it is fair to say I am most known for my map work that I have done for various games down through the years.
What was it then? And you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but again, looking back at the minimal amount of stalking research that I did of you, it seems like Warhammer, specifically maybe Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, or I should say, it kind of caught your attention. What was it that caught you about it, if that is what caught it?
Yeah, so I'm going to broaden this a little because it's very easy to assume that, because my early years were dominated by Games Workshop in particular, and Games Workshop's primary output is known to be Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000, plus a smattering of salt and pepper around the edge. But I'm old enough that when I was into Games Workshop, it's when they were doing licensed material, often of US material, into the UK. So we had Call of Cthulhu, we had Stormbringer, we had Indeed, we had all manner of different games that Games Workshop at that point was producing, often with a Games Workshop label on it, as they licensed to print it in the UK. And my early years were dominated by those games, and also by Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 as well. In my youth, my most played games were all Games Workshop games, without exception. And that included games that people don't often associate with Games Workshop, like, say, Paranoia. The Paranoia RPG is not an RPG you immediately think, oh, that's Games Workshop, but it very much was.
Right.
Or the Stormbringer role-playing game, which for me was a seminal, youthful escapade adventure that I did really enjoy. Did rather enjoy my Stormbringer when I was younger.
So Games Workshop was actually releasing somewhat American titles for distribution in the UK. Okay, I had no idea, because that's such a weird, like, you have Stormbringer, you have Paranoia, which is a West End Games, and stuff from TSR or from was it like
a good mixture, literally a good mixture of all the best hits, so to speak, went through Games Workshop's doors in its early years, in the very first Games Workshop store. And White Dwarf, if you look to the early White Dwarf issues, you're looking up to approximately 90 to 100 in terms of the issue numbers. You'll find articles in there for RuneQuest, for D&D, for Paranoia, for pretty much every major US game, along with their first burgeoning attempts to create their own games. As Warhammer eventually came out, and then as we hit towards issues like 80 to 100, you start seeing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay being talked about more, and then Rogue Trader for what was going to be a 40k role-playing game, but that turned into a full war game as the miniature side came to dominate at Games Workshop. And then as you move through, again, using White Dwarf as a measure, issues in the UK for about 100 up to around about 150, that's when it does its complete conversion over to pretty much being a Warhammer and a Warhammer 40,000 vehicle. It became effectively one gigantic advert.
Right. Yeah. You know, you had mentioned this yourself, so you do seem to be best known for your cartography, but like there's so much more. There's so much more to Andy Law than just cartography.
So much more.
You're illustrator, writer, storyteller, editor, designer. Do you think, did that come from like that do you think it all came from that very first session you sat down with your mom and dad to play, or do you think this is some sort of passion that you always had to sort of be if it's okay to say, be in control from many different angles, or
I think that's a very fair angle. I've always been someone who likes to be the boss, so to speak. When it comes to role playing, for example, I'm an eternal GM. I always have been. It's where I'm happiest. When I'm playing a player, I always look at things that aren't quite the way I want it to be, and I get frustrated, very easily frustrated. And I know that I'm not in a place to change it or modify it to something better. It's deeply in politic. So thus I feel stymied, and I quiet myself down. I purposely don't try to interrupt. And I end up feeling like it's not as creative or as fun as it could be for me. Where if I'm on the other side, I can mess up and miss all those things all I want, but if I notice them, I can change them. And if other people notice them, I'm happy to change them too. So yeah, I've always been happiest on that side. I will freely admit. And in terms of my initial beginnings in gaming, definitely those first sessions, but it's fair to say that a lot of my passion came from going to the art shop with my mum when I was a kid. She would go to the art shop weekly. My dad was a lighthouse keeper, and we lived in a lighthouse. So my dad was away for a month and then back home for a month, then away for a month and back home for a month. So I only saw him for 6 months of the year. And for those other 6 months when he was away, my mum had her hobbies, and she was a painter, and she sold her paintings to various local craft fairs and various businesses like Marconi or whatever. And she'd do like big war paintings or little pictures of does or whatever's required, mostly in oils. And she'd be popping down to the art shop every single week. And our art shop in Thurso, it's a tiny town at the very top of Scotland, which is where I'm from. The shop was called Durrans, and it's still there to this day. And I still make a yearly commute. It's more than a commute, really. It's almost like a pilgrimage up to see Durrans, where I don't know, how could we best say what I did? I hid in the corner and I looked at all the little gems, I suppose, whether they were miniatures, board games, Games Workshop games in particular. Durrans was one of 2 Games Workshop accounts inside Thurso. And they had a broad array of games when I was young, because that's when Games Workshop was licensing lots of games and beginning to create their own. So you got your first versions of, say, Blood Bowl or Talisman or The Fury of Dracula or The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, all manner of different games, because Games Workshop dipped its fingers into lots of different games in those early years of its existence. And they loved that corner of the shop. It was just so different to everything else. And the bright colors mixed in with the tiny miniatures that you could paint yourself. And my mum, who was fascinated with art anyway, very much supporting her son, buying a model, taking it home, painting it up terribly, but with enthusiasm and excitement. So that, combined with my mum's and my family's passion for science fiction and fantasy already, it was pretty much in the cards from the very beginning that I was going to be doing at least some of this on the hobby side, if not more. But as it turned out, it very quickly became more.
It sounds very much like an idyllic childhood. I mean, it sounds like you had some very supportive... Like, what's funny is I talk to sometimes to my friends, or I talk to people that say that their parents not necessarily were not... They were not as enthusiastic about them pursuing things in the arts, because they were looking for them to do something more practical or something more like mom or dad did or whatever. And I often have to say, no, you know, my parents were they were fairly supportive, sometimes almost to a fault in some ways. Yeah. But it sounds like you had like a really interesting, like your mother's an artist and your father ran a lighthouse. That's just...
my mom ended up running a lighthouse as well. Oh. They were both lighthouse keepers at one point. But yes, you're right. It was somewhat idyllic. I lived in the countryside on a big long cliff that was my playground. Not far away, about half a mile away, there was a large harbour where I would sell fish, because I would catch fish myself, and I had my own creels where I would catch lobsters and crabs, and I'd sell them to the bigger businesses down there, because it was just as cheap buying them for a few pounds off me and then selling them for £20 off to one of the major markets, because it was one of the primary ports in the north of Scotland that fed the entire country for the premium side of the fishing industry. So yeah, that was very much the surroundings that I had. I had open, free countryside to just play with, which was lovely, although quite isolating, which is why when you're back at home, you're constantly looking for things to do. And for me, I dived into gaming from a very early age, of all types. I also played snooker and pool. I also played board games of all types. My parents also did that too. So beyond the monopolies, we were constantly playing with different types of games, and that very quickly turned into creating our own games, which is the very foundations towards a career in it, I suppose.
Well, that kind of links to, I was going to ask you something that I had just sort of thought about now. How do you feel, if at all, do you feel like that sort of the region where you grew up and the conditions under which you grew up, and like the idea, like you're describing things to me that are very, very foreign. I grew up in a city. I grew up like with streets. I grew up with nothing that was fairly, to be honest, fairly unique. But the idea of, say, living on a cliff, going to, you know, parents that paint minis with you, parents that work in a light. Okay, one parent, two parents.
My dad was about as artistic as a brick.
That how much do you think that sort of upbringing influenced maybe what you're doing today? And I'm not sure if I'm asking you the question right, because in my mind, to be honest, when I picture where you lived growing up, I'm picturing something out of a fantasy storybook compared to the city streets that, you know, I look out and I see dingy, you know, Boston.
Yeah, I would march out to the head, and up there was an old broch that you could look at. It very much was a fantasy setting for many, particularly those who come from a city. And when I moved down to Edinburgh, where I live now, which is the capital of Scotland, it could not have been more different. To me, it was like a fantasy, but more of an urban fantasy, moving from the old countryside, like the country mouse I was, coming to the big city. But to go back to the actual point of the question, which was, did that help? Absolutely. But I would say it was more than just the environment that helped, because it obviously sunk me into many of what is now considered to be fantasy tropes. But beyond that, it was the support of my parents. When I was 12, I decided that I was going to work for Games Workshop. And I told my parents this, and they were like, yeah, all right, that sounds great. Brilliant. Away you go. You go start your life and do what you want to do. I'd obviously given up on being a lighthouse keeper because lighthouse keepers were being phased out. And as we all know, we want to have the same job as our parents when we're kids. I wanted to be a lighthouse keeper. It sounded ace. But yeah, that very quickly was dismissed as all the lights were slowly automated. And I decided that I wanted to work for Games Workshop in pretty much any fashion. I didn't care what I was going to do there. I was going to work for them. Then my schooling was designed around pretty much that, and my decisions from the age of 12 up to when I joined them at age 18 were designed loosely around that, although most of it was loosely around just having fun as a teenager playing games that I thought were awesome. That was really what I was doing, and the fact that I got a good job in Games Workshop at the end of that was pretty much icing on the cake.
Yeah, and so because again, reading into your history, it's pretty amazing. So you pretty much built your own ramp directly pointed at Games Workshop and just sort of slid down it into the headquarters. What you started a store specifically with an eye toward gaining their attention and eventually working for them? Is that true?
Okay, so yes, it is, but I would say true to a degree, because that sounds relatively calculated, where in truth I was a kid, who thought this might work. It was far more of a throw up in the air and see what actually sticks, or if you want, throw shit in the fan and
right. See what.
I apologize if there's no swearing.
No, no, not at all. Feel free.
I'm Scottish. I find it hard not to swear. It's a constant clenching. I won't. I'm not a teacher, you may note. When I was, let's say, 15, I quit out of school. This really upset my teachers, and I can't express how much. I was a straight A student all the way through. And the idea of me quitting out just to do my own thing, I had one of them, my math teacher, she was almost having an apoplectic fit. She's like, you can't do this. My art teacher, Mr. Mather, he'd already given up on me because I was all into the art, but I couldn't be bothered with the academic side because I couldn't see how that would benefit what I intended to do, which was work for Games Workshop. I was a particularly focused, let's say, special child. And I quit out and I went to the local college, and the local college up in Thurso, up in the Highlands, they happened to have a college that was really handy. And in those years, way back when, there was grants, and that to me sounded astonishingly good because I came from a very poor family in general. And lighthouse keeping, all your bills are paid for you, so they just don't pay you for those parts. So your electricity bills were paid, your telephone bills were paid, your gas, if you had it, was paid, any fuel, anything that you required was all paid. And you even had, to a degree, a food allowance, because the entire time you were at the lighthouse, that was all paid for by the lighthouse board as well. So they were close to minimum wage while simultaneously having nothing to spend on other than your own home stuff, your lovely little luxuries. So I grew up without a great deal of money. So the idea of getting, say, £1,000 or £2,000 to study in university for a year or two at college was astonishing. So I obviously went straight into the most gamey thing that I could find at the college, which was computing, something that I was already pretty well versed in. So it was going to be a breeze. It turned out it was. I dropped in, did that, took their money and went, well, I've now got a lot of money. Immediately called Games Workshop and said, hello, hi. Yeah, okay, I'm a kid. I'm only 16. So let's get that out of the way first, just to make sure that you're fully aware. Full disclosure, I'm a kid, but I'm intending on opening a shop. Now, when I say shop, I don't mean I'm going to have a nice little retail space, a nice high street shop. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run a club every single week out of a scout hut. And we're going to put a shop into that, because that's where it's going to attract customers every single week. They'll turn up. They'll want to build their armies. They'll want to play their games. Oh. I'll sell them their stuff. I'll take orders for whatever they need for next time. I'll contact you and I'll sell it to you. Now, I was fully aware the chance of me getting an account with Games Workshop, being a 16-year-old kid, was super low. But my dad, in one of his many previous iterations, as he moved from hat to hat to hat, was a salesman, and he was fully aware that it was generally end-of-month targets. So he suggested to me, call on the last Friday of the month. Because if you're ever going to get them to say yes, that's the day they're going to say yes. And I didn't know it at the time, but when I later went down to Games Workshop and spoke to all the people that I had been talking to for, at that point, a good couple of years, and we discussed how we all met, it was spot on. They had a target to hit. Wow. They had a target to hit, and they had a target for a number of new accounts and how much money they made as well. And I took them over their target, and there was literally no chance they were going to say no to an extra £1,000 going onto their board. So obviously they didn't give me credit, because I probably would not have been legally liable to pay, because I was only 16. And games, if I completely flunked it out, then what were Games Workshop going to do? Sue a 16-year-old? Right. That's going to look great. Having said that, though, I ended up ordering every single month from them. In fact, it was more than that. It was often twice a month. And by month number 4, I had a complete line of credit because I was ordering so much for them. And it was just faster for them. Rather than waiting for money to arrive and do the whole transactions. They just went, have the credit, you're clearly above board, away you go. Yeah. And that became, from 16 to 18, the thing that I did. I ran a club at the top of the country in Scotland in a tiny little community. And I moved that from being just me and a few friends up to 100 members that were coming in twice a week, every Saturday and Sunday. And I had my shop there that was selling all manner of stuff that they could get. But this all sounds like I was doing it so that, I don't know, I could make money or look like a perfect candidate for Games Workshop. But really, I was doing it because it was an enormous discount for me.
Oh, I mean, right.
Let's be honest. Yeah. I was paying costs for all my stuff. By the time that I had approached Games Workshop, I had every single army that they produced, all of them. So every 40k army and every Warhammer army. For those of you who know those old versions, I had about 2,000 to 20,000 points of every army, which is an astonishing amount of models. And that's because they were so cheap to me. Because whenever people bought stuff from me, hi, I'd like to buy this new Man of War thing or this new Dark Millennium thing, which is just coming out. Every time they bought that, it was like, excellent, that's some more money for miniatures.
That's, wow. So were you thinking at the time, like, I'm going to turn this, I guess you weren't really, you were really in it for the discount? And then were you thinking in the back of your head, right, it's very simple. Games Workshop is retroactively like pulling back their payday for the
I would love to say that it was super calculated, right. It was all done to get the job, but that was, I mean, it was in my mind. Yeah. In that, you know, I'll have run a club. I'll have run a shop. That's surely going to be something that will be useful when I apply to Games Workshop. But really, at the time, when I was 16, 17, 18, the big thing for me was, look at all these models, look at all these games. And we did a big sponsored event, for example, for charity at the club. And we did a 24-hour event. And in that, we did a battle, which was on, the battlefield was about I don't know, 10 yards by about 8 yards. I mean, it was proper huge.
Yeah, that is
really,
huge.
really, really big. And it was, for the Warhammer fans out there, it was approximately 250,000 points on either side. And it was just enormous. And I'll admit, a significant chunk of that army was mine, because, well, I had them all.
Wow.
But it was just so much fun. That's what we were doing. We were doing weekly leagues, having a laugh, playing games, really enjoying ourselves, making up new stuff because we were kids and we didn't really understand the idea of borders, often not understanding the rules we were doing because many of us were kids. So learning systems and also learning where the systems failed because they couldn't quite communicate to us who were their primary customers,
right,
how their games were. There was quite a few games that we just played wrong, but we were happy.
What then? So it's a couple of years that go by. Do you just call them up again and say, you know what? Or do you send in your resume? Do you see like a little ad where they're looking for someone? How did you make the leap from? Oh, of course, with Andy Law, ladies and gentlemen, nothing is conventional. What happened? How did you end up? Because I think you had to move to Edinburgh to work for them. Is that correct?
I did.
Like that's a big leap.
There are many people who think I made a big mistake in doing so, and I have been called out on this multiple times when this little bit of the story comes to light, and I shall explain. I applied to Games Workshop twice. My first time was just it was an advert in White Dwarf. I'll just throw some things down, and I didn't really think too much about it. I got about no thanks, okay, thanks, bye. I was only 17 at the time. When I turned 18, I did my proper application. And I didn't really send it to any one particular person. I just sent it to Games Workshop. And I said, this is me, did a full resume, told them everything that I had, everything that I'd done, and that I wanted to work for them. Can we make this happen, please? And I got a phone call about a week and a half later saying, yeah, sure, this sounds great. We'd like to interview you. Can you come up to our Aberdeen store and get an interview? And we'll probably drop you into retail and we're done. I was like, that sounds great. So I went down to the Aberdeen store. I stayed over with my cousin who lived in Dundee. So Aberdeen is some distance away from there. And I cut my hair, which was down to my waist at that time because I was a classic kid of my age.
Had to look respectable.
Absolutely. I wore a suit. I could not have looked more professional. And I think I shocked the Games Workshop chap, as I arrived. And he was like, oh, wow, this isn't what I was expecting. Right. I was expecting some sort of long-haired weird guy. Because there's no way you're going to be normal when I speak to you, having looked at your resume. And when we just sat down and we had a great time just talking about Games Workshop and the things that I'd done and how I built my shop up and how that had come to pass. He went away and, as it turned out, was so impressed, couldn't tire me because he didn't think that he had the best decision-making process as to where I should go. So he went back to his head office and spoke to the head of retail for the company and said, I've got this really crazy guy from up north who apparently is responsible for an entire one of our accounts up there and runs a club with hundreds of people, owns every army in the game, knows every rule, literally knows everything. I literally can't believe he's real. Do you mind interviewing him too? And he was the head of retail. He didn't interview anyone. He was like, yeah, sure. So I went down with a full-size Space Marine helmet from the Dark Angels company because my mum made it. My mum was a great model maker as well as a painter. So I went down with a full-size helmet under my arm going, well, this is going to be great. I'm going to head office. And when I had my first call with him, a chap named Rob, as I recall, he said, you'll be down there for 2 weeks. It'll be a 2-week interview process, which isn't normal. It wasn't supposed to be a 2-week interview. It was just meant to be me arriving and going away. But because I was from so far away, and they'd heard so many things about me from the sales team, because everyone in the sales team that were selling me the miniatures for my shop, they all knew me. And they were like, no, you need to speak to Andy. We want him with us for a wee while. Can't you do something to keep him there? So I got put up for 2 weeks down in Nottingham in one of the company houses down there. So I went down there. Cut a long story short, because this is a really long story potentially. I arrived, got interviewed by the head of retail, Rob, gave him the helmet and said, if you fancy it, you can just pop that in the corner. He was like, yeah, I'll take that. Yes. He was super pleased to pop that into his office in the corner. Had an interview with me, could barely believe that I existed, and said so as much at the end. By the end of it, he said, you can literally work anywhere. We would be delighted for you to work anywhere. I'm going to go and speak to some other people, though, as well. But yeah, you're going to be great. I ended up having another 2 interviews down there.
Wow.
I worked in the sales office, so that's the direct sales, for a week down there as well. That's just when, for those of you who know your dates for Games Workshop material, that's just when Dark Millennium for Warhammer Warhammer 40k, pardon me, second edition, the battle game had just come out, Dark Millennium. So I was selling that off to various shops and having the time of my life, really enjoying it. I also went around the studio, got a nice tour around the studio there. Absolutely adored that because I was in heaven. Oh, look at that! Hey, art being made! Woo, exciting! Was super, super, super pleased with the whole affair, and at the very end of it, got told that I could work anywhere. He said, "Dude, you're everything that we're looking for. You're 18, you're fresh, you can be trained into anything. What do you want to do?" And I was a kid.
Yeah.
I said, I want to live as close to my parents as I can, please, because I'm a kid. And they're like, "You don't want to work in the studio or in?" "No, I want to work close to my parents, if that's okay." And they were like, "Okay, right. Give me a moment." They went away and they went, "Okay, how about the Edinburgh store?" Unexpectedly, the Edinburgh store is our second biggest store in the entire company. It's sited on the Royal Mile, which is a tourist trap in the very center of the city. And it just so happens their staff are really good. And their turnover is extraordinary. It's far bigger than any other city down in England. We think you'd be a perfect match for there. Away you go, off you go there. So I was like, excellent, perfect. I'm still in Scotland. That sounds great. And with youthful bravado, moved down to Edinburgh pretty much the next week. And found myself in Edinburgh working in their retail. And the reason that a lot of people come back to me and go, "Why did you do that?" It's because I could have worked in the studio. I could have had like equivalent of an apprenticeship in the studio, work down there. I ended up doing little articles for White Dwarf, and that would have completely suited me down to the ground. But for me, the move to Nottingham was enormous.
Yeah.
It was moving to another country.
Yeah.
It was astonishing. It was somewhere that I would take a pilgrimage to, not necessarily live in. And looking back on it as an adult, I'm like, wow, yeah, that probably was foolish in terms of your potential life, but I would not change a single thing about the life I have. So I obviously don't regret any of those decisions, but I nevertheless do look back and go, well done, Andy.
But you know, maybe
life you could have had.
Maybe this comes from me looking back on many opportunities that I kind of, as a youth and not really thinking and all of that, kind of didn't take and took like the road less traveled, or maybe it's the road more traveled. I can't remember what's the one that's less exciting or whatever. But for me, it seems like your passion for the hobby, the profession, the industry, the art, the creation has nevertheless, and I guess I can understand why you'd say I wouldn't choose something different. It has carried you through anyway, right? I mean, you did end up, and I feel like the energy that you had as a youth, and the energy obviously that you have like right now, has propelled you to where you are. So I guess how long was it that you were working there before you actually moved to like behind the scenes?
It wasn't that long in the greater scheme of things, but back then when you're young, it feels like forever.
Yeah.
So I was there until I was about, I think, 21, I think, for my first stint. I think maybe 20. And that felt like a really long time. And by that point, I'd worked up to manager and I was doing managerial things. And the reason I left was because they wanted me to work elsewhere in the company. And I didn't want to leave Edinburgh because I'd established a life here. And I was a particularly determined young fellow, as may have been guessed from the various other things we've discussed. But when I'm focused on something, I tend to stick to it. And I was focused on, I'm going to live in Edinburgh. That's just how it's going to be. And if you want me to live somewhere else, then yeah, no. Okay, thanks. But I'll go off. And then I moved into the hinterlands, deciding what I was going to do with my life. Not long after that, having had about half a year of messing around, I moved into Target Games, which was a game company known for games like Warzone and Chronopia. I moved into their UK sales department, doing their UK sales, and that was fun. I ended up working with their studio a lot, doing games design, writing some articles for their magazine, which I've forgotten the name for now. That was a lot of fun for a while, but that was a company that was on the edge of tipping over the edge, so I resigned from that one as well, right at the point when Games Workshop headhunted me right back again. So I worked for Games Workshop for another about a year, in the Edinburgh store, and again they tried to promote me out. They were like, "You're amazing, go be an area manager," and I was like, "No, I only want to be in at the Edinburgh store. Okay, thanks, I'm happy doing my thing, I'm playing my games, I'm having a laugh." And they said, "But we turned the Edinburgh store into the area manager store, so either you're the area manager or I'll resign." And I resigned. And at that point, I was at a crossroads. What do I do? The games company seems to be, if it's not Games Workshop in the UK, pretty shaky. So do I really want to be involved with that? I'm not entirely sure I do. So I ended up deciding to go to university instead, so off to study English. And then not long after that, with discussions with my wife, we decided, no, we're going to have kids instead. So we went to the kids. And then I had all the time in the world. So I just went back to what I knew, and I redesigned Warhammer from the ground up, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay at that point was on its first edition. And I designed my own second edition entirely, and it was just about finished. As a game set, it was based very much on Warhammer, so it used D6s rather than D100. And it would be a heretical game for most fans of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. But I was building it for myself, so it literally didn't matter. Building it for my own crew. But then the second edition was announced that Green Ronin had just got the license. That's an American role-playing game company. And they were making it on behalf of Black Industries, which was a new gaming imprint for Black Library, which was Games Workshop's publishing wing. And I was like, well, yeah, I've written 400,000 or 500,000 words, whatever. I'm going to play that game instead, because that's the sort of guy I was. Someone else was doing all the work. Great. So I dived into their forums and ended up making posts of all sorts over there. And within about 2 months of being there, I got approached by their staff and saying, would you like to moderate for us? Because you clearly know your stuff. And I was like, yep, sure, not a problem. I'll dive in. Interestingly, one of the players in my group, a chap called Andy Leask, who would later become my business partner, a chap that I met for the very first time when I came down to Dundee for my very first interview with Games Workshop in Aberdeen, because he was a friend of my cousin. He was also singled out to be a moderator, completely separate from
unbeknownst to either one of you.
Yeah, unbeknownst to either one of us. We both contact each other, say, hey, guess what? We're like, guess what? Oh, wait a minute. Are you what? So out of all the thousands of people, they happened to pick 2 people from the same group. Hilarious. And they only picked 3 mods at that point, and 2 of them happened to be me and Andy. So I was then in, and the game came out. That was Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition, and it was released in Edinburgh at Compulsion, a local games con. And bizarrely, I mean, nothing releases there. It must have been the only game ever to be released there. Black Industries sent some staff up there. It's a tiny convention. Goodness knows why they chose to do that. But I was really lucky because I was a very young dad. I had a 1-year-old that was on my back. And that meant I could get into the con early, so I could get into the daddy and baby space, parent and baby space. So I got in early and got to wander around. I went over and spoke to them, and I bought the very first copy ever sold for 2nd edition.
Oh, wow.
So I got the first copy ever sold at retail. And I went home and I tore it a new one. Because I'm at heart, I'm a numbers guy and a games designer, and I can't help myself. And I went back on the forums behind the scenes, and I said, there's issues here, and here. And again, cutting a long story short, that turned into me eventually getting a gig writing for them, because I clearly knew stuff. And a lot of it was about the setting. I wasn't necessarily tearing into the rules per se, but it's very much the setting, small little details that should have been twisted. So I ended up, my first gig on Warhammer was writing for it. But the first gig that anyone saw me do for Warhammer was doing the maps. Because about, I think maybe a couple of months after I'd finished doing my first articles for the game, I got a call about maps because I'd gone down to Games Day, which is the big event that was running at the time for Games Workshop. And I was representing the Black Industries side, so the role-playing side, because I was part of their moderator team. And I went down there and I said, do you see these maps you had in your most recent book? These are some ones that I did. What do you think? And they were like, okay, right, yeah. Let me just take some notes. And 2 months later, I got a call from the art director saying, yeah, could you do some maps for us, please? So I ended up doing the maps afterwards, but ended up from that point mapping pretty much every single role-playing book for Games Workshop's role-playing wing until Black Industries folded.
Now, let me ask you something here, because you know, I have like a couple questions here. I have a few questions. What's interesting to me right now is I know you so well from the cartography work, from the illustration, from the writing. I don't know the not the business end, but I don't know the other side of it where you're talking about running the stores and all of that stuff. And now you're kind of like, it sounds like you're weaving in and out of working for Games Workshop, and if anything, it sounds like they like you so much they keep trying to, in some form or another, they keep trying to pull you back, whether it be, you know, for second edition or for whatever. Where does the creative, like where does the art come from? Where does the write? Because I know you mentioned that you'd gone to school for writing, but now you're making maps. Like, where was the map making happening in the background the whole time?
Yes. I think I alluded to this earlier without necessarily making it 100% clear. So I will. All of it is basically just being a GM, being a DM, being someone that runs games. And as somebody that is a self-confessed eternal GM, this is nothing more than an extension of what I do anyway. And I don't stop. I'm constantly creating new stuff. I'm constantly burning through a new set of NPCs or a new set environment to try and develop into something interesting for a scenario, or a new story beat, or a new way of presenting a session so that it's not what everybody expects. It's one thing that I focus on in particular, because I don't do short-term campaigns for my personal gaming. I tend to do long-term campaigns. For example, my Vampire the Masquerade campaign, that took place over a decade of real time, running from the Dark Ages all the way up to Modern Knights, for any of those of you who know Vampire. My last Warhammer campaign, that lasted for also about 10 years. The next one after that lasted for about 5 years. And during the course of that, two things always happen. Number one, the rules break. It happens every time. The rules are not designed for often the very type of play that they're pitching at. They're designed often around anything from up to about 20 sessions. And then past that, they start to creak at the seams a bit. And sometimes, depending on the rule set you're using and the type of game you're playing, you might find that characters all start to look kind of samey because they reach top levels and everything.
Right.
For Warhammer in particular, I could talk about other games, but since Warhammer seems to be the game du jour, and Warhammer in particular, we're playing the second edition, and it broke for us at around about month 8 of play, where our 17-year-old priestess could easily arm wrestle a dragon and win, could take on the most impressive characters from the battle game and win. But she was a 17-year-old and not necessarily the most effective one at that. She was supposed to be a sort of mid-tier, blessed, interesting character, not top-tier, I can kill everything that walks in my way. So the rules needed to be readdressed, and that became, in many respects, what would one day become the 4th edition of the rules. At least the groundwork and the fundamental framework for parts of that, its core design decision of ensuring that the core rules could last for long-term play, which is pretty important if you're pitching a campaign like, say, The Enemy Within, one of the bigger campaigns out there. That's like a 12-book campaign if you take everything into account. And that's not going to be completed in 20 sessions. So you've got to ensure that your rules can cope. And yeah, that's one thing. So I'm constantly working on that all the way through anything else that I happen to be doing. So when I was manager for the local Games Workshop, for example, I was also running 2 games of Warhammer and Again a Vampire and a bunch of other things, and also board gaming as well, because I just can't help myself. I'm an inveterate gamer. Right. And I'm constantly pulling apart rules and going, well, that's why that one doesn't work. And perhaps we should just change this game a bit, just so it's a bit more balanced and fun. Do this to it, do that to it, because that's just kind of who I am. I enjoy it.
It's amazing, actually, because what's funny is that you're kind of talking in a different dimension here. Like, you're talking in the dimension of space, or I should say of time, right? So I think that, like, when a lot of people refer to a rule set or whatever, or they'll say something's broken or whatever, we're just sort of thinking about the first few sessions or whatever. Yeah. You're thinking long-term down the road for your longer campaigns and longer adventures. And as you go and as you're building your world, the rules start, as I love how you describe it, as they get creaky, and then maybe at a certain point they actually break. Is this they snap? Is this something you've kind of commonly found through most of the games that you've played? Is it, to what would you attribute that to then, from a design standpoint? Like, the people that are making it, are they purposely not really thinking of the future, or is there just a kind of a hole when it comes to thinking about these rules? Or is it just the fact that you sit down and you play it for 1 to something years, an entire campaign, and you notice things that others might not?
Yes, to probably all of that. You've spun up lots of hypotheticals, and all of those hypotheticals in certain circumstances will be the case. In the end, when you're designing a game from scratch, you've got a limited amount of time to try and build something that you hope will work. You've got your limited playtesting time, which for some games might be as long as 6 months, so there's a long development turnaround from an early set of rules through several months worth of game play testing as the rest of the book is finished being written, and then as the game testing comes to an end, they then polish everything off and then release. And even then, as we all know, errata then very quickly follows, and then about a year in, a whole bunch of perhaps much deeper errata tends to hit. Certain spells are found to be far too powerful. Certain outcomes are nowhere near powerful enough as was originally intended for the initial design documents. And one of the great joys about working on an iterative game, so a game that has come through multiple editions, is that you not only have a vast well of experience already out there for how the game works in practice, both on short, mid, and long-term play. But if you happen to hire designers who have been pretty much walking with that game hand in hand, you also have people who have a wealth of understanding of the setting, who have been living in that setting possibly for years. So when they're writing about that setting, they're not just writing about the cool thing that they've just thought about as they're tapping away in the computer, although sometimes it will be exactly that. They're thinking about somewhere they've been. They're describing characters that they've perhaps been role-playing. If they're a GM and it's about various NPCs, they may have been role-playing those characters for years. So they know them really well and often know how to sum them up in a way that makes them much more interesting, because characters that have been inhabited for years tend to be far more developed. They are not just the cardboard cutouts that you get shuffled forward with a little NPC portrait. Okay, and they've got their one little, I don't know, their foible where they're constantly fingering their pipe.
Right.
These are hardly in-depth characters.
But
when you're dealing with an iterative game that is coming at a setting that is well known, you are in a position where you can look at everything that came before and quite literally stand on the shoulders of giants and hopefully create something far bigger. So everything you describe will plague certain games, and all of that is difficult sometimes to necessarily see is going to happen, because as games hit the market, particularly with role-playing games, there are preferences. People play them in different ways. Some people don't like a rule that you love. They throw it out the window and they only use a certain set of the rules. And I think that's something that when we moved into the development of Warhammer 4th edition, a game that I co-designed, we were very aware of that. And we laced options all the way through the rule set to ensure that you could turn it into your hammer rather than Warhammer. So that if you played edition 1, edition 2, or edition 3, and we're coming into this one, there was hopefully something in there you liked. And there was also the very clear and implicit permission to change it into the game that you wanted, rather than going, oh, this game sucks, it doesn't do what I want. Instead says, look, this is how you could do it, but we understand lots of people did it this way in the past. You could do it this way instead to reproduce that. So yeah.
That actually sort of answered the next question I was going to ask, because you had mentioned how there were some fixes that you felt that you brought in for the 4th edition of the game to fix some of those, maybe the higher levels of play or the longer term levels of play. Is there a way, and maybe this might be a dumb question, but maybe
there's no dumb questions.
No dumb questions, just dumb people. So I'll march forth and ask, is how do you picture the marriage between rules and setting for any particular game? So we'll take 4th edition then, because obviously this is something that you've thought through extremely thoroughly. What do you see an ideal marriage of rules with the setting? So you mentioned something about what I sort of presumed in my head to be maybe modularity, where you can make it your hammer, as you put it, rather than Warhammer. But is there a certain feel that the rules should have in order to meet the setting?
Yes, absolutely. And it's something that we've discussed this several times in our streams over on our side. For anyone out there who wants to watch those, it's popped up on multiple examples in the past. We had Francesco Nepatello. He's the designer for the One Ring, 1st and 2nd edition. This came out from Free League. And we discussed this to a degree in depth. And loosely, I agree with everything that he said. And I'll sum it up relatively briefly here. And that's that in a perfect world, having rules that properly reflect the setting isn't just a must. It pretty much should be done. If not, just play D&D and you can play any old setting with that. It's not going to necessarily fit, but you can. And if you want to, there's very recently a new D&D version of Lord of the Rings, for example, from the same studio. So it's very much a thing already. But if you do something that, if you are creating a game to spec, you can create something that nails the setting or nails the tone in a way that a generic set of rules can't. Now, with Warhammer, we had a bit of an issue because we were dealing with a legacy game. So we had a set of rules that were already established that if we played with too much would end up looking like a completely new rule set and would not feel like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And this was especially important for us because the third edition of the game had gone in a completely different direction. It was a big box set, more of a board game in many respects than it was a role-playing game. And it didn't use the vast majority of the mechanics that came from the second or the first edition of the game. And it was widely hated, widely loved by its fans, but by the established fan base, it was just something that they could attack because it was different and nobody likes different. And when we were approaching the fourth edition of the game, we were very keen not to attract that sort of attention. We were hoping to attract a very different type of attention. So we were looking to take the existing first and second edition rules and reproduce all the good from those. But that, to a degree, ties your hand because many of the rules there, they are Warhammer in that they are part of what came beforehand as the legacy rule set, but they don't necessarily nail down the core themes, tone, and mood of the setting. So we did that in a variety of other tricksy little ways where we could, and added a few extra rules in as well. In Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4's particularly, I'll ping out 2 rules as an explanation of that, but I'll also give a little bit of groundwork for how it came to be. I was only a co-author in that. I wasn't the producer. I became the producer for the line after that. But for the actual core book, I was effectively just the collator of everything that everyone said, turn it into the rule set. The 2 core designers, myself and Dom, we had very different views for how that should come apart, which worked really well, mostly, because it meant that we always came up with options. You want to do it that way, I want to do it that way. You want to do it that way, that way, that way. He had last call, though, so we ended up with a lot of rules that I'd written that didn't necessarily marry with a lot of rules that he'd written. But they were all written in little boxes and put as aside, so it was all loosely worked all the way through as one set. Loosely, though, from nailing down the tone, we did it with the actual writing, doing lots of little snippets and quotations to try and nail down the setting, which we could do with the careers. That was apparently done well enough that we won some awards for it. We won the Gold Emmy for Best Writing for that one. And that, in that, we were very much trying to show the tone of the first edition and the second edition. Now, for those of you who don't know Warhammer, they were drastically different. One was a very British, satiristic, often irreverent, dark and grubby game, and the other one was grim and gritty, and the tones were quite different because all the humor had waxed out and waxed is get bigger, had been sucked out, that would be better, as we moved to the second edition. It was a far darker, grayer setting, which was reflective of the battle game at the time. So it wasn't something that was necessarily because it was made by different people. It was reflective of what was asked for by Games Workshop. And when we were doing it, we wanted to return to a lot of that humor because you can't really have darkness unless you have something to counterpoint it against. And one of the great joys of a lot of the original Warhammer material was it was a bit silly. It was quite self-referential. It was often very satirical. And one quotation, for example, is just super daft, but I couldn't help myself. And there's a quotation for a priest of Mor. Now, Mor is the god of death in Warhammer. And it's a chap called Wilhelm Abgott. And he has a nice little bit about one of the holy festivals of Mor, where he says, come the midnight hour, which is when it all goes, we'll all shout more, more, more. Very much referencing, obviously, Billy Idol's, with more, more, more.
Yes. I get that reference.
Yeah. And Wilhelm Abgott just translates to Billy, Wilhelm Abgott, German idol. It's a little, it's sort of hidden. It's most certainly there. When people read it, they laugh.
Yeah.
And that makes it a more entertaining and more enjoyable read when you're
Yeah.
working your way through. They're not all like that, but some of them are like that.
Yeah.
Some of them are dark and grim. Some of them are very matter of fact. Some of them are just pure jokes. So that was one way of nailing down the tone, showing the light and the dark through the course of the writing. But another part was looking at the rule set we had and saying, right, what can we do to ensure that we nail down some of the primary tones? And one of them was, for example, offering the rule for dark deals, which was in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, you roll D100. If you roll your skill or under, you pass, yay. If you roll over, you fail. But you also, as a PC, have fate points, which translate to rerolls and one of the points of the rules. But you can only ever re-roll a roll once. And in Warhammer, your stats tend to start relatively low, the 40 to 50 mark. So needing a re-roll is quite common. And dark deals are, if you've re-rolled and you failed, the GM can say, well, if you want, you can take another reroll, but you take a corruption point. And it's all about that tension about the world itself is dark, and there's dark whispers constantly coming in. And later on in the game, the GM can use those corruption points to say, well, if you do this, I'll take that corruption point away, to make your character act in a way that's perhaps a little bit darker than may originally have been the point. To show the subtle whispers of the Chaos Gods constantly being around the characters near the end times. And the characters themselves are characters with fate. They're marked out. They're important in some fashion or another. So they are also the very characters the gods, if you believe the gods are very real, are going to be targeting for one reason or another. So it all wraps up together and neatly encapsulates the whole idea of this in a very simple rule. And it's those little rules that really work for encapsulating a setting. And you can do that with a generic set of rules because you can add rules on top, but you tend to find that you're sort of stuck with all the trappings of those rules that don't necessarily fit your setting as well. And to a degree, Warhammer's like that. It's got a massive array of rules that are there because they have always been there. And then updating those to try and feel fresh, and then trying to nail down the tone of the setting with extra writing or extra rules as required.
Well, it's interesting all of what you've said, because Warhammer the first edition was one of the I think it was one of the first like 4 or 5 games that I ever played, the very first edition, and I remember the tone, or at least I should say the tone that my friends and I interpreted with. And I do remember the dark. I remember the humor, like this kind of like cynical kind of, there's a bit of cynical play in there. And I remember I stepped away from Warhammer for quite a few years, and then I was reintroduced to it when the 3rd edition box set came out. And I remember being like totally kind of flipped, not to say it's negative. I'm just saying I was flipped upside down because I thought, my goodness, narrative dice and all of these things and boons and banes and all of that. And it was probably one of the first times I ever sort of thought to myself, my goodness, this seems like a very like obvious thing, but the rules the mechanics of it can have such a great impact on the flavor and the play of the setting. You know, the way that you interpret it, even the way that I'm behaving, or the game master is presenting the game, or the players are sort of approaching the game, the thought processes behind like making your choices and making your decisions, and even the narratives to a certain extent themselves. And so for me, like to think about the idea of going from 1st to 2nd to 3rd and now to 4th, it is so interesting to hear about all of the things that go into the different iterations of something. Is there, and ladies and gentlemen, we're totally off the rails, but I'm totally fine with this because he's got super interesting things to say. Can I, to sort of steer us a little bit back on track and blend in what you've been talking about here, I do understand that you've been preparing to run the enemy, your own version of the enemy within for a stream. And so from what I've read on, I believe it was either on your Patreon or maybe it was on another page that you had up somewhere, you had said that you're reinterpreting some of the rules. You're also going to be like making some narrative changes and things like that. Now, I know you probably can't give us any spoilers or whatever, but can you tell us a little bit about Andy Law's interpretation of Warhammer versus what's published?
This loosely goes directly to what we were discussing already, actually. So it nicely leads on from. The rules for Warhammer 4th edition were designed to be your hammer, as we said, because those who started off with Warhammer First Edition tended to have a very small empire, cities with populations of not much more than maybe 10 to 15,000. It was very medieval in nature. The fantasy aspects were dialed down much lower. As we moved to second edition, the fantasy elements were dialed up a bit higher. The populations all dialed up a bit higher when they realized that the populations for the world that they created were so sparse that they were beyond unrealistic. So they required a little bit of rethinking. But the whole world in general was sort of similar. Third, it became a far more heroic game, far more like the computer games in many respects. If you've ever played Warhammer Total War, or if you played Vermintide, or any of the other Warhammer-based games, the older ones like Mark of Chaos or whatever. It was a far more fantastic game in tone, while simultaneously, the actual game mechanics, once you got away from the characters that are presented behind the scenes, were all kind of down to earth as well. And then it came to the fourth edition, and we were trying and rationalize all of these into a single coherent setting. And it wasn't just fruitless; it was actually pointless. But at the same point, could easily be done. So, given that I knew all the editions relatively well, and I had read every single book, and I had been collating all the information for that for a master map of the Empire anyway, which meant I was constantly re-referencing all. It was super easy to try and marry that all together into a single core setting, while simultaneously saying it's totally fine for you to just ignore parts of this. My Altdorf, which is the primary city in the Empire, is freaking enormous. It is the Constantinople, the Rome of its era and its area, because the Warhammer world and the old world doesn't have an equivalent of Rome down in the south in the same way. It's a completely different setting to the real world, and it's a mistake to think it's the same. Altdorf is a very big city, and Marienburg further down the river is even bigger yet. But Altdorf, the second biggest city in the entirety of the old world. My one's huge. It's got a population of about 1 million people in it. And how that works has been entirely established. But that's my version of Warhammer. Other people's versions of Warhammer have a small city of about 15,000, a much smaller location. That marries far more closely to the official maps and makes more sense if you look at the official maps. It doesn't make a great deal of sense if you look at the enormous armies that they field. When, 40,000 go marching out of Altdorf. How? Altdorf's got a population of 15,000.
Yes.
And it's pretty much a city surrounded by forest and marsh and not people. It's not like the real world where you could just have a big agrarian society, because out there's goblins and there's beastmen and there's various other horrible things. It's very much islands of civilization and great seas of horror lying between. So where are these armies from? And in their world, those armies don't exist because Warhammer is not a core setting for them. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1 is. So their version of Warhammer was always going to be different, and ensuring that the rule set allowed for that and also allowed for the bigger, different versions was one of the core design decisions. And what I'm going to be doing with my actual play is effectively inviting everyone into my living room, quite literally have set it up in my living room next door, and inviting you in and showing my hammer rather than your hammer. It's my version of what Warhammer could express. And I just used my old blog name, Lawhammer.
Lawhammer, I was going to say.
It seemed to be the next most obvious step, because it's Lawhammer. It's my version of the Warhammer world. It is absolutely not the official version or anything close to it. It's what I present for my games, or at least this version. I've played different versions even in different games, different campaigns with different themes and different stories being told. So this one is going to be the Enemy Within campaign. I did a lot of work on that right at the very beginning of the campaign, because I was the producer for the entire line at that point. And I spoke to Graeme Davis, who was the chap who was collecting everything together for that campaign. And we waxed lyrical for hours on end, because we met literally every week about different ways that this campaign could be resolved. I started all the seeds, put all those bits and pieces into place, and then I resigned and moved on to a new job. Meaning that, sadly, much of what I put in place never really came to pass. And I've got all these things sitting here going, I could do something with this. I'm going to play it anyway for my own group. Why not stream it? Because that'll be a laugh. Turns out there's lots of good reasons for not streaming it. The largest one being, it's super expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been streaming for 2 years, and I thought I knew how expensive it would be. I was wrong. We spent bajillions of pounds in it. We haven't even started yet.
Well,
we are, however, enjoying ourselves.
If you want, like, here's the funny thing, like, if you're streaming, like, say, like I'm doing right now, and I'm just like a talking head, then you can do that on like a nice budget. But I've given thought and sat down and put pen to paper to figure out. And I used to work in the film industry, so I kind of have a rough idea. But if you want to film an actual play where 4, 5, 6 people sit around a table, it's you write, oh wow, 7 people sit around a table.
7 in my living room.
that is an expensive process, especially if you want to make it look half decent and the sound and audio to be clear and all of that. I salute you, however, doing it. I mean, I honestly wish I could do something like that, but I think it's wonderful.
It's going to be a lot of fun. We've purposely chosen a group that isn't all old hands.
Yes, I saw. Yes.
So 2 of the party are writers for the game. So that's quite fun. 2 of the party are aware of the game and have sort of looked at it. One of them's kind of played it. 2 of them have never touched it before in their life and have no idea what's going on. And it makes for a super interesting group.
Yes.
And we're also doing one other thing, which is never done for the Enemy Within, which will make our version of it completely different from the very outset. And that's that the Enemy Within is designed by its very nature to apply to any potential group. So anyone that walks into it gets swept up into the great epic story that's being told and eventually reaches the end, because who the hell else is going to do it? Where our version of it is, it's the story of our PCs. Every one of our PCs, their backstory is tied into the Enemy Within and the details of the Enemy Within. And not just that, the details of the starter set as well, for those of you who've picked up the starter set for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. There was an entire setup in the starter set about the Emperor doing something particularly unexpected and weird. I won't go into details because it's long and politically boring. But he does something really weird, and that's a core detail to us starting. One of our characters is the child of the person who was dislocated because of that. And the ramifications and politics from that will be the starting jumping point for why they're going to the Enemy Within. They're not doing the Enemy Within because they happen to bounce into it. They're doing the Enemy Within because it's their story and they're driving it forward. And that's completely different, and it will hopefully present the story in a way that has never been seen before. Plus, we're doing all the things that I do, because I don't just do basic stuff. I'll be doing flashbacks.
I can imagine.
I'll be doing all manner of crazy things. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
I was gonna say, I can't imagine, and I'm actually getting really excited to like find out. I want to see any particular ETA on that. Like, do you have any idea?
Yeah, we're starting next year, hopefully January. So we're right on the edge of launch.
Oh wow!
I refuse to put a date until because we've just got a new player who's just agreed to join us. So we've got our full 6. Okay, I want to make sure that she's grounded and happy before we start. So that might take a few weeks. That might take a little bit less. We'll see. But as soon as everyone's happy, we launch, and we're just going for it.
Let me ask this: How did so then? You've told me what your version of Warhammer is going to be about, what Lawhammer is, and you've told me about like the behind the scenes, getting things like set up and calling in like a really interesting kind of cross section of players. Is there anything else you sort of realized in the conversion of going from playing privately in your own home to playing for an audience? Like, is there something that helped you or maybe caused you to change the way you approach the game? Or
yes. Yeah, absolutely. So me being me, I don't do things by half. So I sat down. We're talking about March, about April, I think, last year.
Okay.
This year, the beginning of the year, we decided we're going to do this, and that started the process of, well, if we're doing this, what do we need to do differently? Because what works at a table does not necessarily work for a stream. And we'd been streaming, as in Lindsay and Andy and I and the other people at the Rookery. We'd been streaming at that point for a good year and a half. And a lot of our suppositions and expectations have been thrown out the water. It was an awful lot easier than we expected, but simultaneously there was a lot of things that we hadn't done correctly. And we took that experience to what Warhammer would appear like in its current rule set, and decided that the rules needed a significant streamlining, so that they could be best presented at the table, so that there wouldn't be that slowdown that you can sometimes get at a standard table. We didn't want that. We wanted it to be super snappy and fast, because that works better for a stream. So that meant that I started a new version of the rules where I stripped out an awful lot of the complexity, left the complexity there, but twisted it in such a fashion that it was much easier to get those numbers without having to go through any steps. And that meant that I then rebuilt every career as well, and rebuilt the entire magic system, and rebuilt the entirety of the religious system, rebuilt everything, because once one change goes on, it has a ripple effect throughout the lot. Now, inevitably, the current publishers are going to do the same, because it's now been, what, about 5 years since the rules that I released. They'll probably have their own version coming out in about a year or two, for all I know. I'm not in contact with them anymore. I have no idea what they're doing. But it's reaching the point where they'll have their own edition, I imagine, coming along, which will completely contradict mine. But that's fine. As I said, the whole point of it is your hammer, my hammer. We take the rules that we like, and we pile them all together, and we build ourselves a stream that works best for us. So yes, we are changing the rules. We're also changing slightly the way we play at the table, where there's an awful lot of crosstalk that normally happens at a table. And we have been practicing hard to try and reduce that.
Yeah.
It's really hard. It is really hard because we're all so used to how we play.
Yeah.
But we've done it. I think we're good enough now that when we present the stream, the crosstalk will be low. But we're not going to do that thing where super professional, slick people come along and tidy it up all afterwards. No, we're just going to go. We're going to stream it live. It's going to be in my living room.
Oh, live. I didn't know that. I thought at least you'd be That's great. Nope. It's electric.
Going live.
You can feel the electricity.
And whatever happens, happens.
Yes.
And we're just going to roll with it. And that's going to be part of the fun, I hope, of how we present it. And because of that, we're fully aware that sometimes there's going to be players who can't make it, where, I mean, we're just coming off the COVID era, so we have to dial that in. But I've built a whole bunch of sessions which are designed around having fewer players, designed around giving us flashbacks, designed around giving us different versions of the settings that people may not necessarily expect. So it's all been built in. It does mean, though, that my plan for the entire season lasting 1 year might not come to pass, because we might end up having lots of ill episodes throughout the course of it that mean that it dribbles on a bit further. But if I get it right, 1 year later, we'll have completed the campaign, approximately. It'll take a month or two. And the last 6 months of it will all be the conclusion book. So everything else is crammed into the first.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And extending out the other part, because for those people who've played the game, they've generally always played the first 2 or 3 parts of Warhammer, but they never get but they never get to the later ones.
Right.
So we're going to zoom through those because they're not necessarily important for setting up anything more than some key components.
Yeah.
And then getting to the meat of the end. Really looking forward to it, because our end is really fun.
I have to say, to be honest, I run actual plays every once in a while myself. I did like a longer campaign that lasted close to 9 months or so. It had a clear beginning, middle, and an end. And I've been doing a lot of one-shots recently, but one thing I sort of discovered is that there's a lot of like ramping up to go do a one-shot that lasts for 4 hours, and then all this stuff that I prepped is just sort of thrown by the wayside. Like I collect it, and I'm going to use and do something with it eventually. But the great thing, like the thing that excites me the most is I hear all of the things that you're doing, and it makes me really, 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 really want to kind of know what you're going to do with your take on it.
It's going to be different.
What was it that, and this is a little bit of a rewind here, but I'm very curious to know, what is it that got you into streaming to begin with? Like, I can tell you're definitely interested in so many different things, but a couple of years ago you started with, I think the Rookery is at least like a year and a half or a year.
Yeah, it is. And the Rookery was originally set up because I'd left Cubicle 7. We had some friends that were all sort of in a place where they wanted to do something we weren't sure. We was like, let's do something together because that'll be fun.
Yeah.
We'd all just come off Warhammer.
Yeah.
We weren't working on it anymore, and we wanted to do something for ourselves. And we sat down, we went, we'll do this. And we started on that. But as that developed, this turned into something else. And I then got very ill.
Yeah.
And I can't express to you how many times I've had COVID and how ill I have been over the past couple of years. It has massively dented everything I intended to do. But cut a long story short, we started off with an adventure which is called Ship of Fools. We polished off our first version of it. Graeme Davis and I wrote that one. You may know Graeme Davis from the Enemy Within. And the rest of the team had all contributed ideas, and we had what we felt was a pretty good adventure. We threw that out for a playtest. But we decided that I've been involved with so many playtests in my time, and most of them were kind of a nonsense, in that they were very much done so that they were done, not
Right.
necessarily done so
Yeah.
that they made a difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
And often the points that were raised during the course of the playtest that went contrary to the designer's preferences were just thrown out rather than contemplated. I've been involved in one playtest, which was for a very major product, where all of the groups could as well have not played it, because they all of their comments were disregarded, and the book went out exactly the same as it was before the playtest. The playtest was just one big PR thing, really. That's all it was. And it was noted. A lot of people got very frustrated who'd been part of that playtest. So we didn't want to do that. We wanted to have a playtest that made a difference. So we decided we'd speak to everybody with a stream. We'd say, everybody that come along, hi, this is the Ship of Fools playtest. This is what we're doing. Here's the thing. And we're going to be doing a stream every single week with just you, discussing how you're dealing with the adventure. And we'll hopefully get some of you to come on to the stream, and you can discuss how you've played it with your group. And hopefully that'll inspire anyone who's yet to play it to give it a go in a different way. And we're really interested to see what you think of it, what worked for you, what didn't work for you, and what you can do to adapt it. And we set that up for 10 streams. So once a week, 10 streams. So that was about 2.5 months to 3 months worth of full play testing. And then we would collate all of that, and we would turn Ship of Fools into something different. It was an enormously enjoyable experience, as it turns out. We really enjoyed doing it. And at the end of that streaming, once the Ship of Fools playtest was concluded, we had a wealth of extraordinary material, ranging from the Spaceship of Fools to the Train of Fools to the many different ways that this adventure had been adapted for the individual settings. We had somebody that played it with Call of Cthulhu, because it's not an adventure that has rules, it's a system agnostic adventure. We'd have people who played it with D&D, we'd have people who played it with Warhammer, we'd have people who played it with, I mean, one of them was playing it with the Expanse RPG.
Oh, wow.
And turned it into the Spaceship of Fools, moving through. Basically turned all the main plot points, and if it was a halfling or something fantasy, just turned that into some equivalent from their game, and away they went. It was a belter loader. That was cool, and hearing how it was used really inspired us in a variety of ways, and also made me readdress how the adventure was set up. So we went back and we rebuilt the adventure pretty much from the ground up, and it became from a 10k adventure up to about 40,000 word adventure. So it became a far bigger affair with a bunch of alternate endings, a whole bunch of really cool stuff loaded into it, and we're like, this is awesome. But once the streams had ended after the 10-12 weeks, we just kept on going. So every week we just got together and we talked about some random stuff, and we just streamed it out. About however many months of that later, we were like, well, we're doing this, so why don't we turn this into a Patreon? So if anyone wants to throw some money our way while we're doing some stuff, that'd be great. And we can do some extra bits. So that turned into Inside the Rookery. And we moved from it just being us doing streams to us streaming with a guest from the industry, because we knew tons of people. So we just went, hi, do you fancy coming along and having a chat? And we had our guest. We talked about something once a week. And that took us up to almost to today, I suppose, because we've been doing that for the last year. We had our first birthday in November for doing the streaming part of it for Inside the Rookery. We did that on Halloween, our big Halloween episode, and we gave away a whole bunch of freebies and signed books and such like, because that was fun. Why not? I've got them. And our patrons this for Christmas, as their presents, got posters for the upcoming Ship of Fools bit for the Coil of Crown, because we're using the Ship of Fools to move into a big campaign. But that's only one part of what the Rookery is doing. The Rookery is also building board games. Our first one's already completed. It's currently in the factory going through its test print.
Oh, cool.
We've teamed up with Modifius, if you know Modifius.
Yeah. Might have heard of them. Yeah.
Yeah, you might have heard of them. Yeah, I thought you might have.
Yeah.
We've teamed up with Modifius for that. And Modifius are doing all the heavy lifting and distribution so that we can just carry on creating cool stuff.
You can focus on the stuff that you love.
Yeah, totally. So that's a really nice position to be in, and they've been absolutely marvelous. And that's going through its test prints just now. We're waiting for those to arrive so we can nod and go, just that marvelous. But that's for Dark Deeds. That's a game from Andy Chambers and Mark Gibbons primarily, although this iteration of the rulebook, I did a huge chunk of the writing in that. Not that I was changing the rules, it was just a representation and an update to the rules to make it as clean and as easy to understand as possible.
What
good times.
I actually really, when you mentioned the fact that a lot of times playtests are done for, and they're done almost for like appearance, or at least to say you've done the playtest, and it reminds me so much of, you know, corporate meetings or any sort of like teachers meetings. Not the one I go to at my school. No, not at all. Mine is very
definitely not.
But what do you think? Like, I think it's a common problem for, it doesn't matter whether you're in the game industry or whether you're like in, you know, the business office on Wall Street. Like, I think a lot of people often don't feel like they get the most out of like a meeting which is meant to reflect upon a product, an experience, a creation, a piece of artwork, a story, or whatever. They don't get the most out of it. Is there something, is there one or two things that you think should be done when creators want to reflect on their game design, their setting, or whatever that should be done that's often overlooked?
There's 2 points that I would particularly raise, and we've gone far too far on one of them. And I'm quite happy to say we went well beyond what was required, but I still wouldn't change that we did that. It's just meant that our turnaround for the product has extended significantly. But the first part is ensuring that whatever that you're presenting is play tested. Now, I know that sounds obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. Because there is nothing like having a group playing your game to make you realize that your game is not quite what you thought it was, because the words that are on screen do not necessarily reflect what's going on in your head. I'll give a clean example of that that's not related to my own work. And that comes from Games Workshop with Blood Bowl. Blood Bowl is a great game. You may know it. It's the game of fantasy football. It's orcs and elves and dwarves playing a fantasy version of American football. And the game rules that they built for, not the most recent edition, but the edition before that, very much were rules that were built in the studio and worked beautifully. Play tested, not to death, but most certainly a lot, by all the studio people. But the problem was that they were all good gamers.
Right.
And then when the rules hit the fans, they were like, well, hey, wait a minute. I can foul every turn. Right, okay. And it just turned into a bloodbath for players who were mean. Players who did not play to the spirit of the game, but played to the letter of the rule. And the rules were kind of broken.
Yeah.
They weren't broken, but they kind of were. But it was a beautiful game.
Yeah.
If you were playing it with people who weren't absolutely horrible. But a whole group of people built around that saying, but the rules say I can do this, so why would you penalize me for saying that? And that's completely fair. If the rules allow you to do it, there is no reason you should not be allowed to do that. You should not be seen as a bad player. Nevertheless, some people had a very bitter taste in their mouth when they watched the entire team get wiped out. And that's why you need to ensure that you don't just get it play tested, you get it play tested by people who are not like you. The next one is sensitivity reading. I cannot express how important this is. This is something that is frequently not just forgotten, it's not even considered. You need to get people who are not like you. I happen to be that main set of white guy, middle-aged. I have my own preconceptions of everything, and most of them are wrong. And it's very important to ensure that you get people to come in who are not like you to read your text, particularly because you have a whole host of unconscious biases that you won't be aware that you are hard coding into your text. And you'll almost certainly be horrified by when someone else reads it and said, hey, dude, do you realize how racist this is, or ist this is, in a way that you hadn't considered? And you're like, what? And often, particularly from people who've been in the business for a while, there's a good sense of, no, I'm not. Because they're not. They really aren't. But they are accidentally unbiased and unconsciously, pardon me, expressing a whole bunch of ists they don't intend to, because the language that they were brought up with is very different to the language that other people use in other ways. So ensuring that you've had some form of sensitivity reading, and that you take the time to send it out to different types of people, and hire different types of people if you're in a position to do so, is super important. So there you go. There's my big twos. Play test it and get other folks to read it.
What now? as I've been talking to you for the last hour and a half or so, one thing that is really I know it's been an hour and a half, 1 hour and 36 minutes, I believe.
There you go.
I hope we're okay. I have one or two more questions.
Oh, no, I'm fine. You know, I do 7-hour streams.
I know. I was going to say, this is nothing. This is for you.
It's only an hour and a half.
I would imagine like you're laying in a hammock, just like relaxing as we do this. You're like, oh, whatever.
Pina colada.
Yeah.
With a world's best dad.
There we go. One thing I've noticed, and it seems to be sort of a bit of a theme here, is, and I mentioned the word Jalib actually just said, "Oh, 5 hours to go." Yeah, you didn't know, Andy. We're gonna try and beat your record. Yeah, so don't worry. Don't worry. We'll see what happens. I don't think I can make it. I'm definitely gonna need a bio break.
Glad to see you out there.
So one thing I've noticed is this sort of lack of fear, or this confidence in breaking down and rebuilding things.
Yes.
You know, you mentioned about
Definitely.
the iterative process. Now you mentioned like the idea of sensitivity readers. You mentioned the idea of playtesting it, which are all both processes where you have to face painful truth, potentially painful truths. But it sounds like, you know, as painful as they are, it's not something that you shy away from, and it's something that you seem to embrace. This might be more of a personal question, but like, what do you think it is that, would you say you're a fairly self-reflective person that iterates and changes? And why is it that Andy Law is so good at doing that, and maybe other creators that don't reflect or don't look or throw, why did that big company throw away that stuff that they got?
Because it's expensive and it makes everything take longer, and I'm sure that there are a lot of people who would prefer me to have bloody got Ship of Fools out already, but we didn't because we took on all those changes. So we didn't release it. Equally, the next step, What Rise Beneath, that has become a whole new different thing. So we withdrew that and would turn it into something else, largely because of feedback that we've had behind the scenes. And we're willing to do that, and we have. Now, to answer your question specifically, am I self-reflective? Yes, I always have been, and I've made lots of mistakes in the past. And those mistakes that you make in the past, whether they're yours or seeing somebody else make them, they always stay with you. As I mentioned, there was one big game playtest that I was involved with, and I was horrified to see the outcome of that and the lack of difference impact that it made upon the published material, and also the impact it made upon the playtesters who've been involved, who were rightly upset because many of the issues that they had highlighted when the game was published, everybody else highlighted, and they just fumed even more. And it reached a point where because they were invested in the setting at hand, I won't go into the details, they ended up publishing their own versions for free fan downloads all over the place. But because they weren't playtested either, and they were often very pointed at the issue that they had, it didn't pick up the bigger picture, and often there was maybe a good bit here and a good bit here and a good bit there, but the overall whole wasn't pulled together in a way it could have been. So experience, I suppose, to a degree, has turned me into who I am. But on the sensitivity side, I come from a pretty diverse family, and also a relatively diverse background. From all I say, I lived in the middle of nowhere. We hark back to the beginning of the stream. I did, but Dounreay nuclear power plant was right on my doorstep, which meant that the very best and the very brightest of the entire United Kingdom moved up to the north of Scotland to work as physicists there, and all of their kids were in our public school. There was an American base up there and an early listening post. So they had a naval base and an early listening post for listening to what was the Russians back then, and probably, if they set it up, will be the Russians today.
Probably is today, yeah. Talk about coming full circle. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
My best friend growing up was American. We, unlike Scotland, which was a massively white country, all my friends were of a variety of different backgrounds because they were from the great melting pot of America. So I came face to face with all manner of prejudices in my school that would not have expressed in most of the other schools in Scotland because they didn't have that great diversity of population. And we did. And that, to a degree, has influenced me. I'm in a household full of girls, which influences me because they face a whole host of difficulties that I never faced growing up. I've got 2 daughters and a wife. I've got, without going into any specifics with any individuals, we've got all manner of mental issues. We've got all manner of sexuality things. We've got all manner of stuff in our household alone. And that, throughout the course of your life, opens your eyes up to both yourself and your own predisposition to how you tackle with things and how that may be flawed in certain circumstances, but also the great well of awesomeness that other people can bring in that you may not have considered. I am very much a rainbow household, I suppose, as my hat makes quite clear. My funky little Christmas tree.
And I think your tree, yes.
And as an example of that, when we were handling the gods sections in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, there was a big discussion about whether we should ditch the word goddess in the same way that we ditch the word actress in modern English. Normally we just say such and such is an actor, regardless of what particular gender, sex, or whatever else they claim as their individual identity. We go for actor, and we considered that. And in the end, we sort of stuck with goddess because of historical reasons for the setting. But we had a nice little box in the corner discussing how different careers could express for different genders, regardless of how they may have the word man or woman attached to them, and how that's totally cool. And we built one for the gods that we thought was great. And we sent that over to some sensitivity readers, and the trans community came back with what was some of the best comments we'd ever had. We had nailed what we thought was a very non-gendered, non-binary paragraph, and they came back and went, "Whoa, wow, this is super binary. And this is why." And we were like, wow, I'm really glad you said that, because that's completely going to change how we present this section. And we reworded that. And they were the best people in the world, because they were like, I can't believe you're asking this. I can't believe you're asking for this, because it's so super important to us. And it doesn't really matter to everyone else. It's like, but it does. For us, it may seem like a super little tiny modification, but for you, it makes an enormous difference. And for the vast majority of people, they'll never notice we've made this change. They'll just not see it. It's something they'll gloss over, but for you, it makes a huge difference. So well worth doing. So yeah, why am I this person? I suppose I have been because of the experiences in my life, just like anybody else. And I try to be self-reflective and try to do the best that I can. We live short lives. We want to impact things the best we possibly can with what we can, eh?
Well, speaking of which, then I guess I'll end with this one final question here. What's down the road? So of course you're going to be running the next year of Enemy Within, but is there something that the Rookery is conniving, conspiring to?
Loosely, I have done a lot. We mentioned this through the course of the stream, whether it's mapping for Critical Role, whether it's doing stuff for Call of Cthulhu, or producing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. But I now run my own company with a group of other astonishingly cool people, the Rookery, and we are building a bunch of board games and role-playing products. The role-playing products are currently system agnostic, in that we'll be creating ourselves a bunch of adventures that you can use no matter what system that you prefer. So if you're playing D&D, or if you're playing Warhammer, or if you're playing anything else, you can pick up our adventure, find yourself a bunch of generic stats can be applied to anything, hopefully presented in a way that inspires the characters rather than worries too much about the individual stat numbers, and away you go. And because we've got our forums, people can put up their stats for the individual system of their choice up there if they wish to do so. So that'll all be covered anyway. Our big reason for doing it that way is because all of us had written adventures where it was specifically targeted for a game, even though the adventure itself may have been requested to be generic, so it could be used for other reasons. But the second you stat it, it makes it a beginner adventure, a medium adventure, tail end, top tier adventure. And that's nonsense. How many times have I read this adventure is designed for first to third level characters? Yeah, no, this adventure is designed for role-playing groups having a complete awesome evening. And that's what we were going for. And it was particularly highlighted why that was an issue when I was working with, again, Graeme Davis on a product called Solasta, which is a computer role-playing game. And we were building the tabletop version of it. And that was an adventure that Graeme and I wrote together at the beginning of that, was for beginning characters. And at the end of it, we're like, this is rubbish and stupid. What if I wanted to play this adventure with like 5th level characters? What do? It's just not incorporated into the core text. And it's just as good for them as it would be for anyone else. But because it's been pitched this way, you just can't. So we changed it to system agnostic stuff. So we are building some system agnostic stuff. The first part, Ship of Fools, is finished on the writing side, unbelievably. It's currently going through the remaining parts of the layout and the art. We just released some of the art in our Christmas stream, I believe, or our Halloween stream.
Yes.
Can't remember which. We also, on the Patreon that we have for Inside the Rookery, we popped up 4 pages from that book as well, so people could see where it's currently sitting. That was quite fun. That's getting released pretty damn soon. Again, for the same reasons for that I don't like dates
right
beforehand. They slip. So I'm not going to put a date in it, but we know when it should be releasing behind the scenes. A full adventure beyond that. We also have board games coming too. We got Dark Deeds, which is a board game of dark manipulation and scurrilous backstabbing between a bunch of minions all working for an evil dark master who's attempting to take over the city. It's a quick card game that's super fun with some gorgeous illustrations from Mark Gibbons. Well worth looking at. It's going to be just really pretty. That's coming from Modiphius Nuts. We've got another game which I can't talk about that's almost finished as well. And we also have the actual plays. Wow.
That's a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, like there's nothing I can say at this point to make any stronger a point about what like a diverse and amazing amount of talents that Andy Law has. I think from just listening to him for the last hour and like almost 50 minutes, I think you can see what goes into the immense amount of reflection and thought and care that goes into just about anything he does. And I highly recommend, because he's someone that I kind of knew. I'd heard the name around because I pick up Warhammer and I know something about Warhammer. I know that he's worked at other companies. I've seen the stuff, but I didn't really discover Andy Law until I came upon and stumbled upon the Rookery channel, where it was a veritable wellspring of information, just interesting thought, interesting ideas about gaming, about storytelling, about design, about art, illustration, mapping. We barely, trust me, I have just barely scratched the surface with Andy. There were a zillion other things I wanted to talk about, and like he's just got so much, like so many interesting things and dimensions to him that we were not able. I have put links to as many of the things he does as I could possibly gather together. I'm sure he'll let me know if I missed one or two. I've put links to them I'm sure he will, in the description. Please do go check his stuff out and the stuff that he does with the rest of the team at the Rookery. It's been very helpful to me. I have to say, after about 1.5 or 2 years of kind of like doing this, sometimes I feel like, there's not enough out there where I feel like we're digging deep and I want to find deeper stuff. And finding the Rookery was a source of deeper material about gaming, about narrative, about art, illustration, about putting it all together. I highly recommend that you check it out. And to you, Andy, I wanted to say thank you very much. I know we had we tried to do this a couple times in the past, but I'm so thankful that you are doing okay. I'm so happy for that. I think the world should not be deprived of your creations and the work you do with your partners.
It's been a particularly tough couple of years with COVID on my end. As I said at the very beginning of the stream, I did have it multiple times. And very recently, again.
Yeah, well,
I'm
glad. I am so happy you're doing okay. I'm glad you came on the program. Thank you so much for sparing some time for a little potato like me out here in an ocean of much
That's what it's all
potatoes.
about, isn't it?
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah. No problem. At any time.
Thank you. And so for those of you watching at home, if you've enjoyed this talk, which I am certain you did with Andy tonight, please do think about liking and subscribing. Please think about like the person next to you at the cafe who has walked away and left their phone. Think about opening up their YouTube app and subscribing on that as well. Think about opening some fake accounts and subscribing to my channel as well. Every real account, fake account, they all help, folks. I mean, look at Twitter. It's just all bots now. So For the,
all it is.
basically, and Musk. I think it's pretty much bots. I'm pretty sure.
People sitting there watching the world burn around
Yes,
them.
I think that's what it is. So to all of you out there, thank you very much for watching the channel. I do appreciate your time. Everybody out there, stay safe. Have a great game, and because it's the holiday season, let's go into this new year being of good cheer. All right? Thank you all very much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.